Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another interview today on Finding Me on the ITV networks, again with my very dynamic, brilliant and articulate guest, Tshepo Madlingozi. Tshepo is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria, and in the previous interview we discussed about the transformation in South Africa in the 16 days of activism. But towards the end, Tshepo asserted the need to de-link from Western modernity and to affirm our humanity, and to affirm it, but not to demand of it from basically the white settlers. And I want to take these questions a little further with Tshepo, but before I do that, I want to quote something that he wrote in one of his papers, and it goes as this: Sergei, I have been trying to tell you that our wars were not merely to replace a white face with a black one, but to change a system which exploits us, to replace it with one which will give us a share in the wealth of this country. What we need is another war of freedom. So with that, I'd like to say again, thank you for being here and giving me this time, Tshepo.
Thank you.
And coming back to this quote,
yes,
and what we concluded on in the last interview, where you said it was necessary to de-link from Western modernity. Looking at this, is this transformation about changing the system part of the idea of delinking? And then how do you delink? The question, I mean, if somebody's sitting there and watching this, say, okay, you're saying that, but how do you do it?
Yeah. So, I mean, let's go back. I mean, the quote is a quote from a book called We Shall Sing for Our Homeland by Zeksim Da. And I like the last part. We need another war of freedom, right? Why do we need another war of freedom? Because Western modernity is still a modernity that we are living under today in South Africa. A modernity that says that if you're not European or if you're not white, you are less of a human being. Unless you try to be like a European, unless you try to be like a white person. You will know that Western modernity started in the 16th century when Europe expanded after the expulsion of the Moors in Southern Europe, right? So right from the beginning, Western modernity has always been violent, right? So when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, and this becomes a way of imposing Eurocentrism in the rest of the world, what he's actually saying is that I conquer, therefore I am, right? Therefore it moves to Southern, what is called now Southern America, and there the Europeans come in with the idea that only they can think, therefore only they can create sovereignty. They impose this sovereignty. So Western modernity has always gone with violence, genocide, slavery, and also what Professor Mogobe calls epistemicide, which is the killing of other knowledges that are not Western knowledges. Therefore, it's a very violent modernity. It's a modernity that forces you to negate your own humanity. You will know that other people who always have their own modernities. That is the idea of being modern in the world. African modernities, Islamic modernities, and so forth, right? They've always been there. So what happens with freedom? Freedom must be an occasion, an opportunity to reassert your own African modernity. So that's the idea behind delinking. It's not the idea behind saying, let's be modern more, let's globalize more in Euro-American terms, but to go back to your modernity. You will know that even though there was epistemicide, even though there was cultural violence, not everything was destroyed, right? So a liberation leader called Amilcar Cabral talks about the need to return to the source. What does it mean to return to the source? It means going back to those cultures, traditions that were never destroyed. In South Africa, it means going back to the knowledges that are still contained with our philosophers who are in the villages, who are in places that were not forcibly inserted in Western modernity, so-called the uneducated people.
Mm-hmm.
So delinking, that's what it means. It means not rejecting Western modernity, but assimilating Western modernity technology in your own terms, right? Therefore, this differs a little bit to the process of post-coloniality as an intellectual process, right? Decoloniality is about moving away from this modernity that forces you to negate yourself and assimilate into it. Post-coloniality is an intellectual moment or movement that says the subaltern can also think. Therefore, take our history seriously. Therefore, take our knowledge seriously.
But it's not challenging this particular structure.
It's not challenging that particular issue. That's why most of the philosophers of post-coloniality are based in the United States of America. Homi Bhabha, Spivak, and Edward Said, who was one of the founding fathers of this, right? So decoloniality is about challenging Western modernity and saying we don't need a universal kind of knowledge, which is Eurocentrism. We need pluriversal, meaning different universalities, different ways of being in the world. And that can only happen if you delink from this Western modernity and asserting your own cultures, your own traditions, and your own religions.
Okay, so now I understand everything that you said, and I want to bring it to a very practical example. First, I want to refer to your article which you wrote about racism in the Faculty of Law, and you strongly advocated for transformation in the Faculty of Law. But before we come to this particular question, so to pick up on what you said, people will say, okay, so you're advocating this whole notion of going back to your roots and bringing forth that tradition, that culture, but they'll tell you, well, firstly, it did not exist.
It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, so that, for example, there was never such a tradition or such knowledges. And secondly, even if there was, there aren't qualified or educated people who can now bring this to the fore so that you can start to learn from it. For example, what the challenges that you face is that there aren't enough black academics to teach in the university, or there aren't qualified or capable black academics to teach in the universities. So how do you respond to these kind of very, very stereotypical answers that are passed in the mainstream in order to keep justifying the promotion of a Western modernity?
No, absolutely. I mean, they're not just stereotypes. They're very violent, kind of processes. It's an ongoing process of denying Africans' history, as if the history of South Africa only starts in 1652. When we know that, even when you follow Western modernity or Western science, they will tell you that there was places like Mapumbukwe, right? That shows that there has been civilization, our own civilization in Africa. You go to the great ruins in Zimbabwe. You go to different places of Africa. There were always civilizations in Mali, in Timbuktu. Yeah. There were always civilizations. Therefore, that can be rebutted very quickly to say we always had our own civilization. Is it uneducated? Of course, it's uneducated in Western terms. It doesn't measure to that standard, and we're not interested in that. We are interested in asserting our own kind of knowledge system. That's why in my work, the way I get around this is to use a lot of African literature. Because, of course, if you read people like Chinua Achebe, S.K. Mphahlele, and many others, what they're doing there is a very decolonial project of saying we will tell our history, but not writing it in articles, but through storytelling. Because when you do storytelling, that's when you return to the source. That's when you refuse the idea that things fall apart. The title of Chinua Achebe's book, which is what happens when Western modernity comes in. Things fall apart. So how do you put things together? Is through storytelling. So we can go back to our knowledges. They never died. I mean, every day when we pray in our own gods. We don't use the idea of the Western God or Christianity, right? So the idea that those things did not exist, they did exist. They continue to exist. Even during apartheid, they continue to evolve. So they are there.
And I suppose one of the most prominent examples is the praise singer or the oral traditions, isn't it?
That's right. So that's why, one of the first things that one of the people that I like, S.K. Mphahlele, did when he came back to South Africa was to go back to the villages and record oral poetry. Because it is in poetry that you get history, that you get the idea of harmonizing the living dead, so-called ancestors, and also the unborn, right? You get this in oral poetry. Therefore, these things are still there, and we just need to reassert them. But it doesn't mean it's a rejection of Western modernity. It's the idea that Western modernity in most parts of Africa has been there for less than 100 years, less than 50 years in some places, really. So it's a short history. You can't think that short history should overwhelm everything. Now the trick part of the dilemma is at a university institution, because universities from the beginning were produced to perpetuate Western modernity, to perpetuate the idea that only white people can think, right? Therefore, when some of us come to universities and come to say we want to teach at universities, we want to show that we also have not only the capacity or the capability to teach, but that we want to bring different knowledges. The dilemma here is that you're operating a system that is very white, that is very Western, right? And therefore, perhaps if you operate in it, you are legitimizing it. Take the example of the University of Pretoria and former Afrikaans universities, university that is still very Afrikaans. But we can't leave these spaces. These places are public institutions. They're not owned by white people. They're public institutions. There are a lot of black students here.
You have a responsibility to them.
You cannot abandon them. But it's about what we teach. That's why if you look at the kind of curriculum that I teach in my class, it talks about how the Constitution is ongoing colonialism. It talks about how social movements are still oppressed, or the poor are still oppressed by the law. So you bring a different knowledge set to these students. Right?
So it's about bringing critical thought to the classroom.
Absolutely, absolutely. But also it's about de-linking within the university. And how do I do that? I do that in multiple ways. So about 8 years ago, a student and I set up something called Tshepo's Legal Shibin, right? Shibin, which the idea being, it's not a place for, funny things, but it's the idea that during apartheid, Shibins were spaces where black people could do political discussions without being noticed. So we are saying we'll do the same at the university. We'll subvert the university by using these spaces to push our own agenda. So you say the idea of seceding within the university is the idea of bringing also, de-linking is about bringing in decolonial scholars from other places. Not in a classroom setting, but for them to give seminars, for them to be part of our reading groups. I've got a reading group on decoloniality. So, the past 2 months we brought someone like Professor Louis Gordon, who I know, your viewers will be familiar with. So this idea of also de-linking within the university, refusing the neoliberal agenda of the university, refusing the racism within the university by challenging it, but also by setting up other forums within the university.
Okay, but we have to go to the break. When we come back, we'll talk further. See you after the break. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of the second interview with Tshepo Madlingozi. And before we went on to the break, Tshepo was speaking about how to use the university spaces to subvert it and to de-link from the Western liberal thought and of course Western modernity, and to bring in new critical thought and of course the responsibility of the academic to the students that are there. But Tshepo, you did not answer my question on this one aspect that is constantly pushed forward by the administration in universities, that there aren't enough black academics, and that there aren't qualified black academics, and so the positions still have to go to white people. And I think the greatest, for me, the greatest irony is that one of the greatest benefactors of apartheid in terms of the institutional structure has always been white women. Yet white women still benefit from positions in the university today. So how do you respond to that? And secondly, what is your understanding of transformation when you wrote this particular paper? What should transformation mean in the Faculty of Law?
Yeah, no, the paper is entitled Dislodging Institutional Racism. The title is very significant. So I'm not interested in dislodging racism. The idea that, people should like each other.
Of course.
I don't care about that particularly. I'm interested in the way the cultures, practices, norms of the universities are very racist, and therefore they will continue to favor certain people, right? Then you ask about the idea that, the notion that there are not enough qualified black academics. There are a lot of qualified black academics. Some of the students that I teach are the most brilliant students, but they refuse to become academics. They refuse to become academics because they've seen that the university, institutionally, is a place that is not a home for them. It's not a place where they feel comfortable, so they don't want to be part of that. Therefore, the university, deliberately or inadvertently, produce a sense of not attracting, a lot of black academics. Therefore, you always sit with this problem. So the first thing that the university needs to do is not to concern itself with who's qualified and who's not qualified, is to dislodge this atmosphere that makes black people feel they're not home. You also see cases where some black academics will come, they will teach for 2 or 3 years, and then they will leave because they don't feel at home here. So the notion of institutional racism becomes reinforced because the university itself expels people, quote unquote, and therefore it claims that there are not enough people also, right? So the university needs to change. We need to go to the core of changing the cultures and practices of the university. That's what transformation is about. It's about, in the first place, as I said, changing the institutional culture. That means changing the curriculum. That means changing the language policy. We still sit in a situation that is very funny, where you've got Afrikaans classes and English classes. That in 2015, you've got all white classes. In South Africa in 2015, all white classes, because they are Afrikaans classes. That cannot be in South Africa, right? Therefore, it produces this sense that African students are still privileged. They're still by themselves, and they continue doing what they used to do when they were in high school. They don't mature, they don't grow. So even pedagogically, it does not make sense to have this split language policy. So we need to change the language policy in the second place. But in the third place, we need to insert more and more of different kind of thinking, radical thinking. For example, in law, why do you have to have lecturers who studied law? You can have people who have studied political science, sociology, or philosophy as lecturers, because they will bring different knowledges, they will bring different perspectives.
A multidisciplinary.
And hopefully a very decolonial perspective, not just interdisciplinary and multicultural, but a curriculum that dislodges and shakes the institutions a bit. So that's what transformation means. It doesn't just mean being counting, counting the number of black people, because as we know, some black people can be whiter than white, right? Therefore, it doesn't solve your problem. It doesn't simply mean putting in, text by Steve Biko, by Frantz Fanon. It's about pedagogically, how do you change the mindset of the students so that they become decolonial subjects?
And that they're willing to be a part of this institution.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I found that the apartheid system actually, for white people and for white academics, allowed them to grow and nurtured them through a system of privilege. But post-1994, when they saw that the law had kind of changed, the way in which they still maintained their privilege, yes, and maintained their nurturing was now shifted from privilege to self-preservation.
Yes, yes, yes,
and
yes.
so the system of self-preservation is what you speak about also in your paper when you speak of an intellectual incest,
yes,
when you refer to how the Broeders' Cup keeps reinvigorating itself, and
yes,
it protects, nurtures, and employs whom it wants. And in this case, by the way, it nurtures and tutors and guides specific students,
yes,
so that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, yes.
And is this how then the racism continues from within the institution?
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you see at recruiting patterns, but not recruitment from the level of lecturers, of professors, but right from the beginning with tutors, who becomes a tutor, who doesn't become a tutor, you see a certain favoritism sometimes, right? Where people choose students that they're comfortable with. And of course, people are comfortable with people who look like them, who speak like them, who don't have accents like I have, right? Who've got different accents. So the system reproduces itself in that way. That's why I call it an intellectual incest, right? So these students who's taught as a tutor will become a professor and will continue the same process. That's why today we see that if you look at the statistics in terms of knowledge production in the legal sector, black people only produce 6.3% of knowledge in the legal sector, right, compared to white people. That cannot be in 2015. But also you see this in, some students called black excellence. I don't like that notion. But they came up with this notion to say we should celebrate the fact that black people are very good. They are brilliant black lecturers, but they're not celebrated. And people who are incompetent, people who are very mediocre, but just because they're white, they're presumed competent, they're presumed excellent.
I think many a student would agree with that.
So we see this. So we see this where, the system produces a lot of mediocre people who are not known overseas. You've got people who are full professors, they don't have research projects overseas, no one knows them overseas. But how do you call yourself a professor in your field if no one knows you anywhere, right? So you can see that the notion of favoritism continues, and it will continue unless we decolonize this university.
So we basically have a lot of work to do, and if we are going to decolonize, where must it start? Does the command come from the Department of Higher Education because they are sponsoring or they contribute a certain amount to the budget of the university? Does it come from the university administration? And if you're saying if it comes from there, I think that's going to be near impossible because it's like trying to hit at a brick wall. Yeah. These are structures where I said have moved now from self-privilege to self-preservation. So where do you start? How do you start?
So decoloniality is also about challenging the way we teach and the way we conceptualize the university. One of the ways that Western modernity or Western education is based is with the idea that there are masters and there are students. That lecturers are masters who teach students and students don't know anything. Part of decolonizing is destroying these hierarchies and creating an atmosphere, a community where students and lecturers become a community. And that's where the change should come from. The change will come from lecturers and students working together to decolonize the university. That's why I was talking about these different forums that, I co-established. The decolonial reading group, the discussion group called Legal Shibin, and other forums, right? To create spaces where lecturers and students can say, we demand a different university. So this is a bottom-up project. Yeah, so it shouldn't come from the department. It shouldn't come from top management. It shouldn't come from the state, definitely not from the state.
But I still want to stop you there, because if it's going to come from the lecturers, but the university is not hiring the black lecturers,
yes,
then where does this project begin then? Because in the first place, if you're not granted access to that space, because they're afraid of what you're going to bring to it, how then will you challenge this project?
And that's a different project. That's a difficult project, right? That's why some of us, because we are so isolated in our faculty sometimes, we collaborate with colleagues from other places so that we have sufficient numbers, right, to try to change things, As you know, there's something called the Anti-Racist Forum at the university, which of course, departmental, cross-university collaboration to challenge this institutional racism, right? So you're quite right, the number of lecturers coming in are few, but the few that are not here should not give up. They should try to come together. They should try not to look at their individual careers. Of course, we've seen cases where some black lecturers become head of departments and they continue this black-on-black violence as heads of departments, right? So it's very tricky to become a head of department in an untransformed university because you will continue the lack of transformation. So it has to come bottom-up. So you're quite right. Yes, the state might even go and impose quotas to say in university we need certain number of black people, right? But that's all that the state perhaps can do. That's when people say, but if you do that, you're interfering in institutional autonomy of the university. The notion of institutional autonomy has not benefited us as black people. So we're not invested in the idea that universities must not have any interference from the state. University has been spaces of autonomy, but to push very conservative agendas. So the notion of interference is okay.
And it's necessary at this point.
Necessary, but not the content, because of course the state can also impose its own, narrative and agenda and ideologies, just in terms of the numbers perhaps.
Okay, so in 30 seconds, because that's all we have left, what would be your parting comment or a parting thought?
Well, my parting comment is, to all the students, we've seen a revolution with the students who have taught us a lot in the past few months. That revolution needs to continue. It should continue not just to be about fees, it should also be about how do we decolonize universities. And my message to lecturers is that lecturers, your position has changed. The world has changed. You need to come down to the level of students and be part of student movement. There are no bystanders in this revolution. Lectures must become part of this. That's why about 10 years ago, I published an article called Beyond the Ivory Tower. Beyond the Ivory Tower. And this is the moment. But we can only do that if we decolonize, not just university, because you can't have a decolonized university in a decolonized country. So we need to fight beggars in both sides. Decolonize universities, but also decolonize societies. So that's why my work is both. I'm also an activist in a number of social movements, but also, an academic. And the battle must be fought in both fronts, at the societal level, but also at the university level.
Yes, that's about decolonizing the mind, ultimately.
Ultimately, yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Tshepo, for sharing these ideas with us. And perhaps we'll talk again at another time when I hope that you have victory in the court in the United States. So till we meet again, fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.